So Ethan, how long are you planning to keep pretending you have a real job? My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old, and last Saturday my older brother said those exact words in front of my entire family while we were gathered around my mother's dining table. The room erupted in quiet laughter, the kind people try to hide behind polite smiles, but I could still hear it. Forks clinked against plates, my aunt coughed awkwardly, and my mother stared down at the mashed potatoes like she wished the moment would disappear. Ryan leaned back in his chair with that confident grin he'd had his whole life, the grin of someone who had always been the successful one. The responsible one. The Carter son who actually turned out right. I didn't respond. I just took a sip of water and let the silence settle because, honestly, I was used to it by then. For the last 3 years my family believed I had ruined my life. 3 years earlier I had quit a stable corporate job downtown, a job with a steady salary, health insurance, and a predictable future. In my parents' world, walking away from that kind of security made absolutely no sense. In Ryan's world, it was proof that I was irresponsible. Looking back now, the signs were obvious. The disappointment. The quiet conversations when they thought I couldn't hear them. My father once told a neighbor that I was going through a phase. Ryan had been even more direct. He told people I had burned out and couldn't handle real pressure. At first I tried to explain what I was doing. I told them I was building a software platform. I told them I believed it could become something big. But every time I spoke about it, I saw the same look on their faces. Polite nods. Forced encouragement. The unspoken assumption that this whole startup thing was just a hobby that would eventually fail. So eventually I stopped explaining. It was easier that way. I moved into a small apartment about 15 minutes outside the city, drove the same old sedan I'd owned since college, and worked quietly. From the outside, it probably looked like I had stalled in life while Ryan kept climbing. Ryan, after all, had the perfect story. He worked at a large consulting firm in Chicago. He wore tailored suits. Flew across the country for meetings, and talked about quarterly targets the way athletes talk about championships. My parents loved telling people about him. Whenever relatives visited, the conversation eventually turned to Ryan's promotions, Ryan's bonuses, Ryan's impressive new apartment overlooking the lake. And then there was me. The brother who left his job to try something. I didn't resent them for it. Not at first. I understood how it looked. Success, in my family, was something you could see. A bigger house. A nicer car. A job title that sounded important at dinner parties. What I was building didn't look like success yet. It looked like long nights, takeout containers stacked on my desk, and weeks where I barely left my apartment except to grab groceries. Ryan noticed that too. He noticed everything. Every holiday gathering seemed to include at least one casual comment about my situation. Nothing openly cruel, but just enough to remind everyone where I stood in the family hierarchy. Still working on that little project, he'd ask. Or sometimes he'd say it jokingly to our cousins, Ethan's chasing the startup dream. The room would chuckle politely. I usually smiled and let it pass. But last Saturday felt different. It was my mother's birthday, and the whole extended family had come over. The dining room was packed. Plates covered every inch of the table, the air smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread, and everyone was talking at once. Ryan had just finished telling a story about a major client his firm had landed. My father looked proud, my mother nodded proudly, and my uncle asked Ryan how many people he managed now. Ryan answered confidently, enjoying the attention. Then his eyes drifted toward me across the table. I should have known something was coming. He tilted his head slightly and smiled that same familiar smile. But enough about me, he said casually. Ethan, how's the, what do you call it, project going? The room grew quieter. I shrugged lightly. It's going fine. Ryan chuckled softly. Fine, he repeated. Come on, man. You've been working on that thing for 3 years. A couple relatives exchanged looks. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like he was about to deliver the punchline of a joke everyone was waiting for. So Ethan, how long are you planning to keep pretending you have a real job? Few people laughed before quickly stopping themselves. My cousin stared down at her plate. My mom whispered Ryan's name under her breath like she wanted him to stop, but he didn't. He was enjoying the moment too much. I felt the familiar wave of embarrassment pass through the room, the same atmosphere that had followed me for years whenever my career came up in conversation. And for a second, I almost said nothing again. I almost let it pass like every other time. But then something happened that none of us expected. A knock echoed from the front door of the house. At first no one paid attention. My dad looked toward the hallway, confused, because we weren't expecting anyone else. The knock came again, louder this time. My aunt stood up and walked toward the door while the rest of us remained seated around the table. I could hear muffled voices in the hallway. Then footsteps returning. My aunt reappeared in the doorway of the dining room with a puzzled expression. And standing just behind her was a man in a gray suit holding a leather folder. The room went completely silent. The man looked around the table, scanning faces for a moment before his eyes landed directly on me. Then he smiled politely and said, "Ethan Carter. I'm sorry to interrupt dinner, but we need your signature before the acquisition documents can move forward." For a moment nobody spoke. The man in the gray suit stood quietly near the dining room entrance, holding the leather folder against his chest like he had stepped into the wrong house by mistake. But he had not. His eyes were still fixed directly on me. Around the table I could feel every member of my family slowly turning their heads in my direction. My brother Ryan blinked twice as if he was trying to process what he had just heard. "Acquisition documents," he repeated slowly, the confidence in his voice suddenly replaced by confusion. The man nodded politely. "Yes, sir. We have been trying to reach Mr. Carter for the past hour. The board requested confirmation tonight so the transaction can proceed tomorrow morning." I could feel my mother staring at me now. My father leaned forward in his chair, his eyebrows drawn together in a puzzled expression. For 3 full seconds the room stayed perfectly quiet except for the soft hum of the kitchen refrigerator down the hall. Then Ryan laughed. It was a quick laugh, the kind people use when they think something must be a misunderstanding. "Wait a second," he said, pointing his fork slightly toward me. "You mean Ethan?" The man in the suit nodded again. "Yes. Ethan Carter, founder and chief executive officer." That was the moment the atmosphere in the room shifted. You could feel it the same way you feel a storm approaching before the rain actually starts. My aunt looked at my mother. My cousin slowly lowered her glass of iced tea back onto the table. My father turned fully in his chair to face me. Ryan was still smiling, but now the smile looked forced, like he was waiting for someone to explain the joke. "Founder of what company?" he asked, his voice sharper now. The man opened the leather folder calmly. Inside were several printed documents secured with paper clips and sticky notes. He flipped to the top page and glanced down before speaking again. "Carter Dynamics Incorporated." The name hung in the air. No one said anything because none of them recognized it. And honestly, I did not blame them. I had never talked about it around them. Ryan frowned slightly. "I have never heard of that," he said. The man gave a small, professional smile. "That is understandable. The company operates primarily in enterprise software infrastructure. Most of our clients are technology firms." Ryan looked back at me then, the confidence in his expression fading just a little more. "Ethan," he said slowly, like he was expecting me to confirm this was some kind of misunderstanding. I set my glass down on the table and stood up from my chair. The wooden floor creaked softly under my shoes as I walked toward the doorway. Every pair of eyes followed me across the room. Looking back now, that walk probably lasted only 5 or 6 seconds, but in that moment it felt much longer. When I reached the man in the suit, he handed me the folder without hesitation. "We just need your signature on the acquisition approval page," he explained quietly. "The legal team is finalizing the closing documents tonight." I flipped through the pages slowly. The numbers printed on the contract were familiar to me. I had seen them many times over the past week during negotiations. But my family had never seen anything like it before. Behind me I could hear Ryan's chair scrape against the floor as he stood up. "Hold on," he said. "Acquisition? What acquisition?" I glanced over my shoulder. His expression had changed completely now. The amusement was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained was confusion mixed with something else I had not seen in his eyes before. Uncertainty. My father stood up as well, resting one hand on the table. "Ethan," he said carefully, "what is going on?" I paused for a moment before answering. Not because I was unsure what to say, but because I had imagined this moment many times over the past 3 years. I just had not expected it to happen like this, in the middle of my mother's birthday dinner with half the family watching. I looked down again at the final page of the contract. The acquisition value was printed clearly near the bottom of the document. $68 million. Then I picked up the pen from the folder and said the only thing that came to mind. "It is just paperwork." I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room as I held the pen above the document. My brother Ryan was still standing beside his chair, staring at the papers in my hands like he was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made no sense. My father had not moved either. He looked from me to the man in the gray suit and back again, the way someone looks when they realize they might have misunderstood something important for a very long time. I signed my name slowly at the bottom of the page, the pen gliding across the paper in a calm, steady motion. Ethan Carter. When I finished, I closed the folder and handed it back to the man in the suit. "Thank you," he said politely. "Our legal department will finalize everything tonight. Congratulations again." He extended his hand and I shook it. "We will contact you tomorrow morning with the final confirmation." Then he nodded respectfully to the room, turned, and walked back down the hallway toward the front door. For several seconds after the door closed, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier now, like the entire room was holding its breath. Finally Ryan broke it. "What was that?" he said, his voice no longer confident. I walked back toward the table and sat down again. My plate of food was still there, untouched. The roasted chicken had gone cold. "It was just a contract," I said calmly. Ryan shook his head slowly. "No, do not do that," he replied. "You do not get to brush that off like it is nothing." My mother looked between us nervously. "Ethan," she said softly, "what company was he talking about?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I was hiding anything, but because I had not planned to explain any of this tonight. But now there was no way to avoid it. "Carter Dynamics," I said. Ryan laughed again, but this time the sound was tight and uncertain. "You mean the company he just mentioned? That is your company?" I nodded once. "Yes." Ryan stared at me like he was waiting for me to smile and admit it was a joke. When that smile never came, his expression slowly hardened into disbelief. "Since when?" he asked. My father folded his arms across his chest. "Ethan," he said carefully, "you told us you were building a software project. You never said you owned a company." I leaned back slightly in my chair and exhaled. Because every time I tried to explain what I was building, nobody really listened. That statement made the room quiet again. My aunt shifted in her seat. My cousin looked down at the table. Ryan rubbed his forehead with one hand. "Hold on," he said. "Let me understand this. You quit your job 3 years ago to start a company. And now some lawyer just showed up talking about an acquisition." He paused. "How big is this company exactly?" I thought about the easiest way to answer that question. We have about 40 employees now, I said. Ryan blinked. 40. My father straightened slightly. Employees? I nodded. Most of them work remotely. Software engineers, product designers, infrastructure specialists. Ryan stared at the table for a second before looking back up at me. You are telling me you built a 40-person technology company and never mentioned it to your own family? I shrugged gently. I tried to mention it in the beginning. My mother looked confused. But Ethan, you always said you were still working on your startup. I gave a small smile. That is what Carter Dynamics was. Ryan shook his head again, still trying to process everything. Okay, he said slowly. Even if that is true, what was that lawyer talking about? Acquisition documents? The room grew quiet once more. I could feel the tension building again, the same way it had moments earlier when the man first appeared in the doorway. My father spoke before I could answer. Ethan, he said firmly, how much money are we talking about here? I looked down at my plate for a moment. Then I looked back up at them. The company that is acquiring us is a larger cloud infrastructure firm based in Seattle, I said. They want to integrate our platform into their enterprise system. Ryan leaned forward slightly. That is not what Dad asked. I nodded. I know. My mother clasped her hands together nervously. Then answer him, she said. The entire table was watching me again. And in that moment I realized something strange. For the first time in years, no one in that room was laughing at me. No one was making a joke about my career or asking when I was going to get a real job. Now they were just waiting. I took a quiet breath before speaking. The acquisition offer, I said slowly, is $68 million. The number hung in the air like a sound nobody in the room knew how to react to. $68 million. For a few seconds nobody said anything at all. My mother blinked slowly, as if she had heard the number incorrectly. My father leaned back in his chair and exhaled quietly, the kind of breath someone takes when their brain is trying to catch up with information that does not fit the story they have believed for years. Ryan was the first to move. He laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded hollow. That is not funny, he said. I looked at him calmly. I am not joking. Ryan's smile faded completely. You are telling me, he said slowly, pointing toward the hallway where the lawyer had just left, that someone is paying $68 million for your company? I nodded once. My aunt whispered something under her breath. My cousin leaned toward her mother and quietly asked, did he say million? My father rubbed his temples with one hand. Ethan, he said carefully, that kind of number does not just appear out of nowhere. How long has this been happening? I thought about that question for a moment. The negotiations started about 6 months ago, I said. Ryan stared at me again, disbelief still written across his face. 6 months, he repeated. And you never mentioned any of this? I shook my head slightly. No, my mother spoke softly now, almost cautiously. But why would you keep something like that from us? I looked around the table at the faces that had spent the last 3 years assuming I was failing. None of them looked hostile anymore. They looked confused. Curious. Almost nervous. Because the last time I tried to explain what I was building, I said calmly, everyone assumed it would fail anyway. That statement landed heavier than I expected. Ryan opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. My father lowered his hand slowly from his forehead. Ethan, he said, we never wanted you to fail. I nodded. I know. And I meant that. My family had never been cruel in a dramatic way. They just never believed in something they could not see yet. Ryan pulled his chair out and sat down again, leaning forward with both elbows on the table now. His voice had lost the playful tone he usually carried. Okay, he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Let us say this deal is real. How much of that money actually goes to you? That question made a few people shift in their seats. It sounded more like a business negotiation than a family dinner. I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip before answering. After investor shares and employee equity are accounted for, I said, my portion would be a little under $20 million. The room went silent again. My mother's hand moved slowly to her mouth. My cousin stared at me like she was looking at a stranger. Ryan leaned back in his chair slowly, the way someone does when the floor beneath them suddenly feels less stable. 20 million, he repeated quietly. My father let out a soft whistle under his breath. For years the narrative in this house had been simple. Ryan was the successful one. Ethan was the one still figuring things out. That story had been repeated so many times it became a kind of background truth that nobody questioned anymore. And now, in the span of a few minutes, that story had completely collapsed. Ryan finally spoke again. So all this time, he said slowly, while we thought you were struggling, you were building a company worth $68 million. I shrugged lightly. Something like that. My aunt leaned forward curiously. What does the company actually do? She asked. I smiled slightly. We build cloud infrastructure software that helps technology companies manage large-scale data systems more efficiently. My cousin blinked. So, like technology for other technology companies? Exactly. My father looked thoughtful now, his earlier confusion turning into something closer to respect. And there are 40 employees working for you? Yes, I said. Ryan looked down at the table for several seconds before speaking again. When he finally looked up at me, the expression on his face was different from anything I had seen before. It was not confidence anymore. It was not sarcasm. It was something quieter. Something uncertain. You built all of that, he said slowly, while we were sitting here making jokes about you being unemployed. I did not answer right away. Instead I glanced around the room at the same dining table where so many of those jokes had happened over the past 3 years. Then I looked back at Ryan and gave a small, calm smile. Pretty much. Ryan stayed quiet for a long moment after that. It was strange seeing my older brother like that because Ryan was never the quiet one in the room. He had always been the person with the answer, the person who explained how the world worked, the person everyone else listened to when conversations turned serious. But now he was just staring at the table like he was trying to replay the last few minutes in his head and figure out where the story had gone wrong. My mother finally broke the silence. Ethan, she said gently, why did you never tell us things were going this well? I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands together on the table. It was a simple question, but the answer was not as simple as it sounded. I tried to talk about it at the beginning, I said. But after a while it felt easier not to. My father looked puzzled. What do you mean easier? I looked across the table at Ryan before answering. Do you remember the Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago? Ryan's eyes lifted slowly. For a second he did not respond, but I could tell he remembered exactly what I was talking about. That dinner had been one of the first times I tried to explain what I was building. At that point Carter Dynamics was barely more than an idea and a few lines of code on my laptop. I had just quit my corporate job 2 weeks earlier, and everyone at the table kept asking what I planned to do next. I told them I was starting a software company focused on cloud infrastructure tools. I remember explaining how the platform could help large technology companies manage data more efficiently across distributed systems. I talked about how the market was growing and how there were opportunities if we built the right architecture. Ryan had listened quietly for a few seconds that night before leaning back in his chair and smiling the same way he had smiled earlier tonight. That sounds ambitious, he said back then. But startups fail all the time. My father had nodded slowly. My aunt asked if I had a backup plan. My mother asked how I planned to pay rent if the company did not make money. None of them meant to discourage me. They were just asking practical questions the way families do. But Ryan had gone one step further. I still remembered his exact words. He looked at me across the table and said, "It sounds like you are gambling your career on a software idea." The room had grown quiet back then too, the same kind of quiet that happens when someone says something that sounds logical but still lands a little too hard. I remember smiling and saying I believed in the idea. Ryan shrugged and said, "Well, if it does not work out, you can always go back to a normal job." I looked around the dining room now at the same people who had been at that table 3 years ago. After that dinner, I said calmly, I realized something. My mother leaned forward slightly. "What?" she asked. "That if the company succeeded," I said, "I could always tell everyone later. But if it failed, I would have to explain it over and over again." My father slowly nodded, understanding the logic behind that decision. Ryan rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. "So, you just stopped talking about it," he said. "Pretty much," I replied. I focused on building the product, hiring engineers, finding customers, raising capital. Talking about it at family dinners did not really change any of those things. My cousin looked curious now. "Wait," she said. "You raised capital too?" I nodded. "Yes. We closed our first funding round about 1.5 years ago." Ryan blinked. "Investors gave you money?" "Yes," I said. "A venture capital firm in San Francisco led the round." My father looked impressed now despite himself. "How much funding did you raise?" I answered honestly. $8 million. My aunt let out a small gasp. Ryan leaned back again, shaking his head slowly like he was still adjusting to an entirely different version of reality. $8 million, he repeated. "And you never mentioned that either." I smiled faintly. "You were busy telling everyone I was unemployed." That line was not meant to be cruel, but it still made the room shift uncomfortably. Ryan looked down at the table again, this time with a hint of embarrassment in his expression. My mother quickly tried to soften the moment. "Ryan did not mean it like that," she said gently. Ryan did not respond right away. Instead he stared at his plate for several seconds before finally speaking. "No," he said quietly, "I kind of did." The honesty in his voice surprised everyone at the table, including me. He looked back up at me then, his expression serious now. "I thought you were making a mistake," he admitted. "I thought you walked away from a good career to chase something unrealistic." I nodded slowly. That was a reasonable assumption. Ryan exhaled and leaned back in his chair again, looking around the room before returning his gaze to me. "I just did not realize," he said carefully, "that while we were all assuming you were failing, you were actually building something this big." I shrugged lightly and glanced toward the hallway where the lawyer had appeared earlier. "Most of the time," I said calmly, "the biggest things are the ones nobody sees until the very end." The room stayed quiet for a while after that. Conversations that normally filled our family dinners had completely disappeared, replaced by a kind of careful silence that felt almost unfamiliar in this house. I picked up my fork and took a small bite of the now cold chicken on my plate, mostly because I did not know what else to do with my hands. Across the table Ryan was still studying me like he was trying to understand how the past 3 years had unfolded without him noticing. Finally he spoke again. "So this whole time," he said slowly, "when we thought you were just sitting in that small apartment working on some side project, you were actually running a company with 40 employees. I nodded once. "Yes." My father leaned forward again, curiosity replacing the earlier disbelief in his voice. "What exactly were those 3 years like for you?" he asked. I thought about that question for a moment. The truth was that the last 3 years had not looked impressive from the outside. Most days started before sunrise with coffee and a laptop at the small desk in my living room. In the early months Carter Dynamics had only been me and 2 engineers working remotely from different states. We spent weeks building the first version of the platform, fixing bugs, rewriting entire sections of code when things did not work the way we expected. There were nights when I slept only 4 or 5 hours because we had a system failure or a client demo the next morning. I explained some of that now as everyone at the table listened quietly. In the beginning it was mostly trial and error, I said. We were trying to build infrastructure software that could handle massive data loads without slowing down enterprise systems. That kind of technology is complicated. Sometimes we spent an entire week solving one technical problem. My cousin looked impressed. That sounds exhausting. I smiled slightly. Sometimes it was. Ryan rested his chin on his hand while listening. And the investors, he asked. How did you convince people to give you $8 million? I thought back to that moment. The first time we demonstrated the platform to venture capital partners in San Francisco, I said, they realized the architecture could scale much larger than most existing systems. My father nodded slowly. So they believed in the idea. Yes, I said. But they also believed in the team we were building. Ryan looked thoughtful for a moment before asking another question. Were you ever worried it would fail? That question made me pause again. I had asked myself that same question many nights during those early months. Of course, I said honestly. Every founder worries about that. There were times when we were running low on cash or when a potential client decided not to move forward. Those moments make you question everything. My mother watched me carefully now. But you kept going. I nodded. Because the product kept getting better. The more I explained, the more the mood around the table shifted from shock to curiosity. Instead of assuming I had made a mistake, my family was now trying to understand how the company had grown so quickly without them realizing it. Ryan looked around the table before speaking again. I guess we all assumed something completely different was happening, he admitted. Most people do, I said calmly. Startups usually look messy from the outside while they are being built. My father gave a small thoughtful nod. And now another company wants to buy the entire thing. Yes, I said. Ryan leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. I have to admit something, he said quietly. Everyone looked at him. Ryan was not usually the type to admit mistakes in front of the whole family. But tonight was clearly not a normal night anymore. For the past 3 years, he continued, I honestly believed you had walked away from a good career and were slowly realizing it was the wrong decision. I nodded slightly. I figured that was what you thought. Ryan met my eyes directly across the table. I was wrong, he said simply. The statement hung in the air for a second before my father spoke again. It sounds like you built something remarkable, Ethan. I gave a small shrug. I just kept working on it. Ryan glanced toward the hallway again where the lawyer had stood earlier, then back at me. And tomorrow, he said slowly, that company becomes part of a $68 million deal. I nodded once. Ryan leaned forward slightly with a faint, almost disbelieving smile. You know what is funny, he said. 5 minutes ago I was joking about you not having a real job. He paused before finishing the thought. Now it sounds like you might have built something bigger than any of us imagined. Ryan's words lingered in the room for a moment after he said them. Nobody rushed to change the subject. Nobody laughed it off like a casual comment. Instead, the entire table seemed to sit in that realization together. 5 minutes earlier I had been the brother everyone quietly assumed had made the wrong life choices. Now the story had shifted in a way none of them expected. My mother was the first to speak again. She looked at me with a mixture of pride and confusion. I still cannot believe you kept all of this to yourself, she said softly. I gave a small shrug. It was easier that way. My father rested his hands on the table and studied me thoughtfully. You must have been under a lot of pressure, he said. Running a company like that while everyone around you assumes it is failing. I smiled faintly. Pressure comes with the territory. Ryan looked up at that and shook his head slowly. I keep replaying something in my mind, he admitted. All those dinners where I made comments about you still figuring things out. His voice was quieter now than I had ever heard it. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was helping you face reality. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You were sharing your perspective. Ryan let out a slow breath and rubbed the back of his neck. Well, my perspective turned out to be completely wrong. The room stayed calm, but the tension had shifted into something reflective rather than uncomfortable. My cousin broke the silence with curiosity in her voice. So what happens next? She asked. If the company is being acquired, what do you actually do after that? I thought about how to explain it in a way that made sense. The acquiring company will integrate our platform into their existing infrastructure, I said. Most of the engineering team will continue working on the technology under their organization. My father nodded. And you? He asked. Part of the agreement requires me to stay on for at least 18 months as an executive advisor, I said. Ryan raised his eyebrows slightly. 18 months? Yes, I replied. They want continuity while the integration happens. My aunt looked impressed. So even after the acquisition, they still need you. I smiled a little. It is part of how these deals usually work. Ryan tapped his fingers lightly on the table, thinking. I have worked around corporate acquisitions before, he said. But I never imagined someone in our family would be on the founder side of one. I noticed the way he said that. Not with sarcasm. Not with disbelief. Just with quiet acknowledgement. My mother reached over and gently squeezed my hand. You should have told us sooner, she said. We would have supported you. I looked at her kindly. You supported me the best way you knew how. My father nodded slowly. Sometimes support looks different when people do not fully understand what someone is building. That was probably the most accurate way to describe it. Ryan leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table like he had earlier in the evening, but now his posture was different. It was not confrontational. It was thoughtful. You know something interesting, he said. Everyone looked at him. When Ethan quit his corporate job 3 years ago, I remember thinking he was making a reckless decision. He paused briefly before continuing. In my world, stability always meant working for established companies, climbing the ladder, building a predictable career. My father smiled faintly. That is the path most of us understand. Ryan nodded. Exactly. Then he looked back at me. But you chose something completely different. I shrugged lightly. I chose uncertainty. Ryan gave a small laugh. Uncertainty that apparently turned into $68 million. The comment made a few people at the table smile for the first time since the lawyer had walked in. My cousin leaned forward excitedly. Do your employees know about the acquisition yet? She asked. I shook my head. Not officially. We will announce it to the team tomorrow morning. My father looked impressed again. That must feel satisfying, he said. I thought about that for a second before answering honestly. It feels like the end of one chapter. Ryan tilted his head slightly. And the beginning of another. I nodded. Exactly. Ryan sat quietly for a moment after that. Then he looked directly at me and spoke with a tone that was far more sincere than any conversation we had shared in years. I think tonight taught me something, he said. The room listened carefully. Ryan continued, success does not always look the way we expect while it is happening. He gestured around the table slightly. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting quietly in a small apartment working late nights while everyone else assumes they are struggling. I gave a small smile at that observation. Ryan returned the smile, a little sheepishly. Next time, he added, I might ask a few more questions before deciding I understand someone else's situation. Ryan's comment seemed to settle something in the room. The tension that had filled the air earlier was gone now, replaced by a quieter kind of curiosity. For the first time that evening, the dinner actually started to feel like a normal family gathering again. Plates were moved around the table, someone refilled glasses with iced tea, and my aunt finally began eating the slice of birthday cake that had been sitting untouched for nearly half an hour. My mother looked around the table with a soft smile. "Well," she said gently, "this has turned into a much more interesting birthday dinner than I expected." A few people laughed at that, including me. Ryan leaned back in his chair and folded his arms thoughtfully. The earlier tension between us had softened into something more reflective. "I still cannot get over the timing of that lawyer showing up," he said. "If he had arrived 10 minutes earlier, he would have heard me making jokes about you not having a real job." I smiled slightly. "I thought about that too." Ryan shook his head and laughed quietly. "Talk about terrible timing." My father chuckled. "Or perfect timing depending on how you look at it." Ryan nodded slowly. "That is fair." My cousin leaned forward again, clearly fascinated by the entire situation. "So tomorrow your employees find out the company is being sold," she said. "What do you think their reaction will be?" I thought about that question carefully. "Probably a mixture of excitement and surprise," I said. "Most of them know we were exploring partnership options, but the full acquisition will still be a big announcement." My father looked impressed again. 40 employees, he repeated thoughtfully. "That is a lot of people depending on the company you built." I nodded. That part always felt more important to me than the valuation numbers. Ryan glanced at me with a curious expression. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The product and the team were always the real achievement," I explained. "The acquisition is just the outcome of those things working well together." Ryan considered that for a moment before nodding slowly. "That actually sounds a lot like how successful companies grow." "Inside the consulting world too," he admitted. "The difference is that you built it from nothing." I shrugged lightly. "Every company starts somewhere." My mother looked at me warmly. "I wish we had understood sooner how serious this was for you," she said. I smiled reassuringly. "You understand now, and that is enough." The conversation drifted for a few minutes after that into lighter topics. My aunt asked about the technology industry. My cousin wondered what living in San Francisco had been like during investor meetings. Even my father started asking practical questions about how acquisitions like this are structured. Ryan mostly listened during those conversations, occasionally asking a question but spending more time observing than speaking. That alone told me how much the evening had shifted for him. Finally, after a while, Ryan spoke again. His tone was calm and thoughtful. "You know something interesting," he said. "I have spent my entire career advising companies on strategy and operational efficiency." I nodded. "I remember." Ryan continued, "But sitting here tonight, it is strange realizing that while I was helping other companies grow, my own brother was quietly building one from scratch." I gave a small smile. Everyone builds their career in different ways. Ryan looked at the table for a moment before raising his eyes again. "I think the part that surprises me the most," he said slowly, "is that you never once tried to prove us wrong." My father looked curious. "What do you mean?" Ryan gestured toward me slightly. "Most people in Ethan's position would have brought it up at every family dinner. They would have reminded us how the company was growing, how investors were backing them, how everything was working." He paused briefly. "But Ethan never did that." My mother nodded slowly. "He is right." Ryan looked directly at me again. "You just kept working quietly while we assumed you were struggling." I shrugged gently. "Building something takes a lot of energy. I preferred to spend that energy on the company rather than on explaining it." Ryan smiled faintly at that answer. "Well," he said, "I guess the results speak for themselves." My father raised his glass slightly. "I think this moment deserves a toast," he said. Everyone looked toward him. He lifted his glass a little higher and smiled proudly. "To Ethan," he said. "For building something none of us saw coming." The rest of the table slowly lifted their glasses as well. Ryan looked at me and gave a small nod before raising his glass too. To Ethan, he said. I raised my own glass quietly and clinked it with theirs. For the first time that evening, the room felt completely relaxed. And as I looked around the table at my family, I realized something that had taken 3 years to become clear. Sometimes the most powerful moment is not proving people wrong. Sometimes it is simply letting the truth reveal itself when the time is right. The soft clink of glasses faded as everyone took a sip and slowly set their drinks back on the table. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely from where the evening began. An hour earlier my brother had been joking about me pretending to have a real job. Now the entire table was looking at me with a kind of curiosity that had never been there before. It was not admiration exactly. It was more like everyone was adjusting to a version of reality they had never considered possible. My mother smiled warmly and reached for the knife to cut another slice of cake. Well, she said cheerfully, we should probably continue celebrating before this birthday turns into a full business conference. A few people laughed and the conversation loosened again. Plates were passed around and the sound of forks tapping gently against ceramic returned to the room. For a while the topic drifted away from the company and the acquisition. My aunt told a story about a neighbor who had recently moved to Arizona. My cousin talked about a trip she was planning to take later that summer. It felt normal again in a way that family dinners usually do after an unexpected moment passes. But every once in a while someone would glance toward me as if remembering the number that had been mentioned earlier. $68 million has a way of lingering quietly in the back of people's minds. Ryan sat quietly through most of those conversations. He was not withdrawn or uncomfortable. He simply looked thoughtful, like someone reflecting on a lesson they had not expected to learn that evening. Eventually he stood up and walked toward the kitchen to refill his glass of water. When he came back he stopped beside my chair instead of returning immediately to his seat. Ethan, he said quietly. I looked up at him. His expression was calm now, the confidence that normally defined him replaced by something more sincere. Can we talk for a second? I nodded and pushed my chair back slightly from the table. We stepped a few feet toward the hallway where the noise of the dining room softened into a background murmur. Ryan rested one shoulder lightly against the wall and looked at me. I meant what I said earlier, he began. About being wrong. I crossed my arms loosely and listened. Ryan continued, choosing his words carefully. For a long time I thought I understood how success worked. I thought it followed a certain path. Good school, good job, promotions, stability. He paused briefly before continuing. When you stepped away from that path, I assumed you were making a mistake. I nodded slowly. That was a fair assumption. Ryan shook his head slightly. Maybe at the beginning. But what I should have done was ask questions instead of making jokes. He glanced toward the dining room where the rest of the family was still talking. I guess I never realized how easy it is to misunderstand someone else's journey when you only see the surface. I smiled faintly. Most people only see the surface. Ryan gave a small thoughtful nod. Tonight made that very clear. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet between us felt different than the quiet earlier in the evening. It was not tense or awkward. It felt more like the closing of a long chapter in our relationship. Ryan finally smiled, a little sheepishly. You know, he said, if someone told me this morning that by dinner time I would be congratulating my younger brother on selling a technology company for $68 million, I would have said they were joking. I laughed softly. I probably would have said the same thing 3 years ago. Ryan straightened up from the wall and extended his hand toward me. Congratulations, Ethan, he said sincerely. I shook his hand and gave a small nod. Thank you. When we walked back toward the table, the rest of the family looked up curiously. My father raised an eyebrow slightly. Everything good? He asked. Ryan smiled and pulled his chair out again. Everything is good, he said simply. My mother placed another slice of cake in front of me and shook her head with a proud smile. I still cannot believe we almost spent this entire evening thinking you were unemployed. I chuckled quietly. Technically I was self-employed. The table laughed at that. The conversation continued late into the evening after that. Stories were shared, plans were discussed, and the earlier tension faded completely into the background. But as the night wound down and people began clearing plates from the table, I found myself reflecting on something Ryan had said earlier. Success does not always look the way people expect while it is happening. Sometimes it looks like quiet persistence. Sometimes it looks like long nights in a small apartment that nobody else ever sees. And sometimes it looks like a moment at a family dinner when the truth finally reveals itself without you ever needing to argue or prove anything at all.